When I first started street photography, I put way too much emphasis on my camera settings.
I think at some point in time, I heard someone say on the internet, you have to shoot in manual mode. And so I thought, okay, I'll shoot in manual. What that resulted in was a constant emphasis of my camera settings every time I went out to shoot. Okay, maybe it wasn't that bad. But I would say I was putting way too much emphasis on my camera settings to the point where I was missing photos because of it. And this was at a stage of my learning process where I should have been prioritizing what really matters, what actually leads to great photos, and that's the ability to notice. Flash forward to today, and camera settings really have just become nothing more than just another part of the tool that I use. Getting a shot in 100% focus or getting my exposure right will never be more important than actually getting the photo to begin with. You've probably heard of the camera mode aperture priority. It's the mode that my camera is pretty much set to all of the time these days. Now, the point of this video isn't to talk about aperture priority mode, but it is an important part of how I treat camera settings today versus how I used to. A lot of today's newest digital cameras can do quite a lot, almost to the point where cameras have become a bit convoluted, I'll say. They can do so many new and different things, which is great if you need those things, but for the most part, we really only need a few key things for a camera to be functional for us to use for something like street photography. So just because your camera can shoot HDR, has AI autofocus, or can order you food, it doesn't mean you have to use those things. Although I'd probably use the food ordering thing.
So I feel like when it comes to new digital cameras, in my case, I don't really need a whole lot of internal specs for photography.
Actually, most of my technical needs are more for video making, but that's a whole other topic. If you ever pick up one of my camera guides I made for the X100V, XE4, or GR3X, you'll see that my camera setups are pretty simple. And that's the whole point. Most of my setup process is turning things off and making the camera more functional out of simplification. So this is all to say it's okay to simplify your camera if this is going to mean you're going to get better use out of it. For me, that involves using aperture priority and letting the camera do a lot of the work. I'll set my aperture relatively high, which will create a rough focus zone, and that lets me put less emphasis on getting my focus 100% right. So when I was first starting out photography, I did put a lot of emphasis on camera settings, but I also put a lot of emphasis on gear, specifically lenses that opened up very wide. I looked at lenses with wider apertures, ones that, open to f1.4 or 1.2. I viewed those lenses as the best lenses, and that meant I needed those lenses for me to get better photos, which you don't necessarily need that. Ironically, today, these Fujifilm f2 prime lenses are my go-to lenses, and I swear by them for street photography. My favorite street photographs I've ever taken to date are taken on these lenses. And it doesn't matter that they only open up to f2 or aren't the sharpest lenses available. Now, this is just my personal opinion, but I do feel like these are the best available lenses for street photography or travel if you have a Fujifilm camera. And that's simply due to the fact that these are so compact, so light, just ergonomically fit Fujifilm camera bodies the best. They aren't the sharpest and they might not produce the best image quality, but I really haven't felt any need to improve the image quality I get from these lenses. I think there is something to say about incredibly sharp images from digital cameras that almost looks unreal, like it's better than real life. And I personally don't like that look. And I find that the sharper lenses that I use, the higher megapixel counts that cameras have, I get closer to that digital look that I don't really like in my images. If you know my work, you know that I shoot in a lot of abstraction. So I actually welcome that muddier, less sharp image that my older lenses create. It almost contributes to this paint-like aesthetic in the photo, which I really enjoy and actually prefer in my photos. I guess my point is that I'm fine with using like the less sharper lenses, the lenses that can't open so wide and only go to f2, which really leads me to the main way I treat my camera settings, and that's shooting at much higher apertures. I've been shooting at around f8 or above. This creates a deep depth of field look that I've really grown to like in my photos. It's a look that, of course, not everyone is going to like, but I like that lack of separation now between foreground and background. One of my favorite photographers, Harry Grayart, shot at high apertures and frequently used foreground objects or subject matter as layers in a scene. He almost treated people on the street as these characters on a stage. Studying photographers like Grayart, Haas, and Leiter, I've found that incorporating the environment as a compositional tool is a really great way to add depth to a photo. And I actually made a whole video on this topic, which you can watch somewhere around here. It's a simple trick to create a cleaner composition. You can create depth through layering and also even potentially add more context to a photograph. And this is also one of the main reasons why I've been shooting at higher apertures like f8 or higher. Because with a higher aperture, I'm able to shooting in this deep depth of field, so I just have more things in relative focus. I want to take a quick moment to talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. I always felt like having a place online for my photographs to live beyond my social media channels was an important thing for me. That's initially what made me want to create my own website. But now, over the years, my Squarespace site has really expanded beyond that, and it's no longer just a place for my photos to live, but also a place for my business to grow. It takes no prior website building experience to get started with Squarespace and creating a professional-looking website for yourself. So if you're interested in setting one up, you can visit squarespace.com/Faisal and use the code Faisal to get 10% off. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. So shooting at higher apertures and letting my camera do a lot of the work choosing shutter speed and ISO for me, it's really simplified the shooting experience. I don't have to worry about my settings at all. And on top of that, I don't really have to worry about my focus either. You may have heard of zone focusing before. It's a bit tricky to do with Fujifilm cameras, unfortunately, but since I'm shooting at higher apertures, I can sort of do zone focusing in a way. I can basically use autofocus for a certain distance in front of me, and afterwards I don't really have to press the focus button, my back button focus. Just focusing to that point, maybe a few feet ahead of me, puts me in this focus range because I'm shooting at f8 or higher. And the higher aperture I use, the bigger that zone is. Shooting like this, I will say, I don't always get subjects 100% in focus. In fact, I probably 90% of the time get subjects slightly out of focus, but in focus enough where the photo is still completely usable. Going back to this idea of trying to distance myself from that overly digital look, I've actually found that slightly out of focus images like this can help create a look that feels less digital, less sharp, just because it's slightly out of focus. Saying this sounds so weird and so counterintuitive, but I do like the look of the images that I get that are slightly out of focus. I feel like this image is a great example to use because it is slightly out of focus, but I think the image benefits from that. I feel like a broken record here, but of course this is subjective, so you might disagree with me, and that's totally fine. Actually, the fact that you've made it this far is quite an accomplishment, and I applaud you for that. I was using a pretty low shutter speed as well for this photo, but the man here is definitely not 100% in focus. And same as this image, you can see when I zoom in, there's a bit of a softer look created in camera that I don't think you can just create by lowering your clarity setting. Obviously, I can't say this is how anyone should shoot, but treating my camera settings and not being so picky of my focus, it's all sort of contributed to helping me find a particular style in my street photography, and overall just making the shooting experience a lot less complicated and in a way freeing for me to focus on what really matters, and that's observing and being present in the environment that you're in. Since treating camera settings like this, I've never really missed a photo because of my camera settings. And I feel like I'm taking better photos because I'm just that much more focused on what's happening around me and being an observant photographer. And that's an invaluable thing to have as a photographer. And I feel like that's what a lot of us are sort of looking for out of a camera. And I feel like it doesn't matter what camera you have, you can apply this approach to settings on any camera. If you find you're in a bit of a struggle with your camera settings, you feel like you're putting way too much emphasis on them and you're finding it getting in the way of you taking the photos you want to take, then maybe you try this approach out and who knows, maybe it works for you. So I hope me sharing, my approach to camera settings now can maybe help some of you that are a little stuck, but don't feel like you need to approach settings like I do in order to, get good photos. Obviously, you got to do what works for you, and that's why I'm sharing this, because this is what ended up working for me. And maybe you're the same.